So every day in the winter for many years, I go jogging along my boulevard down to Coney Island, and I go under an overpass, and in the winter, there are always homeless people sleeping under the overpass. Mexicans who have insufficient funds for an apartment, let alone a house. And they're always bundled under these raggedy blankets. And every time I pass them, I think to myself, I'm going to give them one of my winter coats, because I have a whole closet full of winter coats going back to when I was 16 years old. A very good mighty map for those of you who go back that far. And there must be 10 winter coats there. Why not give them 1, 2, 3, or 4? I never use them. But, to be honest, as resolute as I am in my decision, I'm going to give them the winter coat, I come home for years, and I never do. But I also know if 20 or 30 people calling themselves, in Gandhi's terms, satyagrahis, practicers of nonviolent civil disobedience, if they were to block the street where I live, and they said, we're holding up traffic to remind you that there are homeless people out there, they need your winter coat, you should do something. I know me. I would take 4 coats, so I'd be the first one out there carrying the coats and giving it to the people in the street. And that's for him what politics is about. To try to get people to act on what they already know is wrong. But there's one hitch, one caveat, one qualification. In order for it to work, nonviolent civil disobedience and so forth, in order for it to work, it's not enough that your means, your methods of action are just. It also requires that your goal is seen as just. You can have the purest of actions, absolutely nonviolent, absolutely harmless to anyone apart from yourself. But if the public doesn't agree with your goal, then they're not going to respond to your tactics. So what does that mean practically? I saw a young lady yawning, so as with my students generally, I'll call on you in a moment. So if you take the United States, most public opinion polls show Americans are divided about 50-50, right down the middle, on the question of abortion. 50% of Americans call themselves pro-choice, 50% call themselves pro-life. So let's take a thought experiment. Let's imagine the 50% of Americans who call themselves pro-life. They converge on all the abortion centers in the United States. And they say, we're going to go on a fast unto the death until the doctors stop performing abortions. That's what they say. You can't quarrel with the tactic. It's the most ultimate of self-sacrificing and harmless tactics. A fast unto the death. So, is there anyone here who would volunteer to acknowledge they consider themselves pro-choice as against using the labels pro-life? Can I call you pro-choice? Good. So, if I were to ask you, if a pro-life person went on a fast until the death to stop the commission of abortions, would that move you? To want to stop it, the abortions. Yeah. No. And she says it without any doubts. She's absolutely resolute. And most pro-choice people would say, I hope they do fast until the death and they drop dead. unless there's agreement on the goal, however just your means are, they are not going to reach a broad public. The public has to agree with you on the means, and the public has to agree with you on the goal. So, if they don't agree with you, instead of creating a movement, you end up creating a cult. Instead of building a movement, you create a cult. And Gandhi was actually a good illustration, because most people know Gandhi as a political leader, a leader of the Indian independence movement. But Gandhi was also an ashram leader, simultaneously. He did both. An ashram was like a cult. And Gandhi was a very tough taskmaster. If you were in Gandhi's ashram, you weren't allowed to eat meat, of course, because he's a vegetarian. You weren't allowed to have sex because he's a brahmachari. You weren't allowed to wear wristwatches. You weren't allowed to wear underwear. You weren't allowed to read in the toilet. You weren't allowed to tell idle jokes. Gandhi was very tough as an ashram leader. But he understood you can't use that standard for trying to build a mass movement to end the British occupation of India, because very few people will join. So we have to be careful that when we set a goal, the goal is going to be one that can reach public opinion, that can reach the broad public. And then the question is, all right, we want to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. What should the goal be? And here I think there's only one standard possible and one conclusion possible. The standard is, and let me say it here straight away so there's no confusion later on. The standard is not what you think, or what I think. And it's not what you think is morally right, and you think is morally just, and you think is morally fair, or what I think is morally just and fair. There's only one possible standard if you want to build a movement to finally put this conflict behind us. And that is what the broad public is ready to hear and ready to support. And if you look at the most representative political institutions in the world today, or if you look at the most respected institutions in the world today, the same conclusion comes up over and over again. And that conclusion is that the only settlement of the conflict that can reach a broad public, that will resonate with a broad public, is the two-state settlement on the June 1967 border, a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967, the right of the Palestinians to exercise self-determination in the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, with occupied East Jerusalem as its capital, and for there to be what's called in the standard literature a just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. That's the standard. It's not my standard. It's the standard which is across the board recognized by the whole of the international community. So what does that mean concretely? If I were to ask this young lady here, what would be the most representative political institution in the world today? You would say, global institution, yeah. You. Mm-hmm. whoever, it's not, excuse me? Yeah, the United Nations General Assembly. And every year, the United Nations General Assembly puts forth a resolution to resolve the Palestine question. It's called Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine. And every year, the vote is the same. They say there should be a two-state settlement, there should be a full Israeli withdrawal from the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, and the whole of East Jerusalem, and there should be a just resolution of the refugee question. And now you judge for yourself whether or not the vote is controversial or whether the vote is what you would call quasi-unanimous. 1997, the vote was 155-2. The whole world on one side, the United States and Israel on the other side. 2004, the vote was 161-7. The whole world on one side, Israel, the US, Australia, Grenada, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau on the other side. In 2008, the vote was 164-7, the 7 being Israel, the US, Australia, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Palau. In 2010, last year, the vote was 165-7, the whole world on one side, the 7 again, Israel, the US, Australia, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Palau. And as it happens, this is a kind of fortuitous evening because the vote just came out today on the vote for 2011. And the vote for this year was 167-7, the whole world on one side, and then the usual suspects on the other side. Now, some of you might say, what about those, some of you might say, what about those Arabs? How are they voting? And it's true that the Arab countries have their own organization, apart from being, of course, member states of the United Nations. They have the Arab League. And in March 2002, the Arab League put forth what came to be called the Arab Peace Initiative. And the Arab Peace Initiative simply echoed the terms of the United Nations General Assembly. They said they support a resolution of the conflict, which is 2 states in the June 1967 border, just resolution of the refugee question, and they also added, if Israel goes along with this settlement, we will normalize relations with Israel, which means normal trade, normal trade and tourism, normal trade and tourism. What was the vote in the Arab League? It was very close. There are 22 members of the Arab League, and the vote was 22-0 in support of this settlement. Some of you might say, okay, well, what about those Muslim states, those crazy Islamic Muslim fundamentalists, so on and so forth? And it's true, they have their own organization. It's called the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And the OIC consists of 57 members, all the Muslim countries in the world. And the OIC voted in 2002 to endorse the 2-state settlement along the June 1967 border with a just resolution of the refugee question. And the vote in the OIC was also very close. As I said, there were 57 members of the OIC. The vote was 57-0. Now, it's important to bear in mind The OIC includes the Organization of the Islamic Conference. It includes the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran went along with the majority. If you look at the UN General Assembly vote beginning in 2004, that peaceful settlement of the Palestine question vote, Iran was with the majority.